before we get started, I want to just give a little information about AEON3. Most of you already know about us, but the overview is AEON3 is about the third era of mankind. The way that I look at it, the first two eras, the first eon was when mankind was under the thumb of nature and basically lived as animals. And then the second eon is when we began writing things down, developed writing and language, which took us to the modern age. And we're still in the second eon. I believe we will turn to the third eon, and in that time, mankind will exceed nature and will no longer be under the thumb of nature through various technological means that we have at our disposal. So AEON3's point is to discuss with people about the coming technology changes and how those technology changes are affecting the future of mankind, which is what we do here. I also want to talk about our sponsors just for a second. Thanks very much to the Doc HB, which does the live Facebook broadcast, to Pixel Nova, and Hans, who runs the video shoot and camera for our Facebook Live. Everybody give Hans a big round of applause. There you go. We had in our early sessions, we had a lot of technical difficulties, but we've moved past that. Hans has changed out some of his gear tonight, so we have a little different feeling to the broadcast today. So that's our sponsors. And we want to talk about national boundaries. So to talk about national boundaries, I want to start with a definition of what is a nation. And this is the definition, for those of you who can see it on the screen, is a large aggregate of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language, inhabiting a particular country or territory. A body of people marked off by common descent, language, culture, or historical tradition, whether or not bound by the defined territorial limits of a state, or C, an aggregation of people or peoples of one or more cultures, races, etc., organized into a single state. That's an interesting definition when you think about it, because none of those three really applies to the United States of America, right? And it seemed kind of a weird definition. A country is a nation with its own government occupying a particular territory, is a state. I always find it funny when one definition is a different word that means the same thing, which means you didn't define it. Or an area of land distinguished by its political autonomy. And I think that's probably the most legitimate answer of what a nation or a state is. Kind of an interesting problem, though, that when you look at the very definition of the word nation, it's a little vague. So nations are interesting. We all live in them today. But do we need them? Did you guys ever think about who gives the nation the power? Where does this come from? And why do we do it this way? What's the point of a national boundary? So what I want to do is kind of go backwards in time a little bit and talk real briefly about the history of nations and where they came from and where they're going. Kind of an interesting way to approach it. Of course, this is where they come from. When human beings were just starting out, we were in tribal units. We kind of naturally organize ourselves into tribes. Once we're in a tribe, we have to have some kind of a leadership structure within that tribe. That's a very natural human thing. We want to be part of a tribe or a group. It's something that you see recreated in meetups like this one. It's something that people do just naturally. It's very, very good and safe to be together in a group. So that's really the beginning of nations right there. It's just us, or we instinctually do it. And then I have a video for you guys to watch. And while I'm talking, you guys can check this out. I'm going to try to make it full screen. This is on YouTube for those of you who want to follow along. So what this is from 3000 BC, the growth of city-states and then empires. So it'll go really fast, and then it'll get to the modern era, and then it'll slow down. But as you watch that, it's kind of hard to see, I realize, but you can see the beginning of all the original empires, the original things. They weren't nations. What most people don't realize is that nations is a brand new idea. We didn't used to have nations. In fact, most of the globe wasn't covered or controlled by anybody. It was just land. So we had empires. We had originally tribes, then city-states, and then empires. But empires are not nations. So empires could wander around fighting against each other, and their borders would move. But they really weren't the same as our national structures that we have today. I think we're to the point here where it slows down a little. Yeah, so now it's going forward. So now you're looking at 600-700 AD, and you can see the empires growing and shrinking. And I know that's probably a little small for you guys to read, but really, really interesting watching how they move across the planet. No concept of a national border, right? There's no structure like you know today in the movement of these these empires as they bump up against each other and push back, right? The Mongol Empire pushing against China, and then China finally, and Russia really wiping out the Mongols and taking that over. And this is where it goes back and slows down a little. This part I found really interesting. So that's just something to think about. You notice how much of the globe says Britain, Britain, Britain all over it. Kind of interesting. Not a nation, an empire. The age of empires is really where we built this up. And that came from monarchs, right? So when we built monarchies controlled their city-state with their empire directly top down. So there's no concept of borders. During the Dark Ages, everyone wanted to, let's cancel that before it goes crazy. Everyone wanted to kind of, be their own national, their own kind of city-state. Let me get back to this real quick, 1 sec, sorry. There we go. So there was a time of evolution here that really started in the late 1400s, early 1500s, where things began to change. And the old empire way of being kind of changed, and we weren't going to be like that anymore. So in 1485, Henry VII fought the War of the Roses. Now the War of the Roses was interesting. It was really a war against Catholicism. And this, during the Dark Ages, it's hard to downplay the role that Catholicism had in the Western world. So if Ragesh was a king, and Michael, you were a king, you might want to make a truce, or you might want to talk to each other. But you can't really do that because it would be giving up your sovereignty a little bit, right? So you want to have an intermediary that can go in between these two. Because if Michael sends one of his people to Ragesh, there's a very good chance that Ragesh is going to misinterpret that and send him back headless on his horse, right? So you need an intermediary that you can trust and that you know will tell you the truth. And those intermediaries were priests during the Dark Ages. They were the ones that roamed between the towns and could act as a conduit between monarchs. And that's an interesting point, and it really gave the church a lot of power. And that is really why the Catholic Church grew to be such a powerful entity, is it was between the kings and queens. Get that? Now wind that forward into Spain, France, and Great Britain, and the challenges that they had between each other in their early 1400s. So really a lot of power in the church to control this. England didn't like that, and a lot of people didn't like that. They wanted to become Protestant. How do you become Protestant in a Catholic-controlled world? You fight wars. That's what happened. And a lot of these wars were about trying to squash anything that wasn't Catholicism. So the War of the Roses was a war in England that eventually the Henrys won and made it so that you could have any kind of religion you wanted. You didn't have to be Catholic. In fact, they made it illegal to be Catholic during that time. So the reason that is the beginning of nations is it gave people in England something to feel nationalistic about. It was something English people wanted that they weren't allowed to have, and he really rallied the English people around the War of the Roses cause. Get it? So people started to feel a little more English and not so much Catholic. Then in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella took all of Spain back from the Muslims that were living there and threw them out of the country. This unified Spain as a Catholic nation under King Ferdinand. And again, very nationalistic, starting the feeling of we're not a monarchy, we're a different kind of thing. We're Spain. See the difference? Before you were a subject of your king or queen, but during this time frame, you're now feeling a little more like the member of a thing that doesn't really have a name, because it's an empire, right? Makes sense? So then in 1584, Ivan the Terrible united Russia and brought all the tribes together and made it into a single monarchy-led nation. And again, you see what's happening. Empires are getting to a certain moment where they're becoming something more than an empire, something different. In 1638, Louis XIV created his absolute monarchy in France. And this was probably one of the most important moments. This was one of the most powerful nations in all of Europe, suddenly had a very French ideology under Louis XIV. And we all know what happened to Louis XIV, right? In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia was created. And that ended the War of the Roses. And the Catholics lost that. I mean, there's no other way to say it. They tried to squish Protestantism, they failed. And the peace that ended that conflict is this treaty, the Peace of Westphalia. And in there, they created something new. They created a thing called a nation state in the treaty and gave them sovereign rights over their citizens. And it really defined what a nation was. And this, for most people, is the beginning of the nation state. 1648. That is very modern. Then in 1789, you guys remember this, the French Revolution happened. And that's because the French people were feeling like French people, and their monarch suddenly wasn't the symbol, wasn't the leader of the nation. They felt that the people should be the leader of the nation, largely because of the events that had happened over the last 100 years before that. So you can see the people changing, becoming nationalistic about their nation-state identity and less about their monarch. Big change. And then in 1871, there was unification in both Germany and Italy, creating their kind of nation-state feelings, and they became nation-states as well. So the big one was in 1919. The Treaty of Versailles ended World War I and created a bunch of new nations, gave them defined borders, defined them as national entities, and then of course that led directly to World War II. And at the end of World War II, there was the same thing where we created new nations that didn't exist before the war. Kind of interesting. So one of the things that's kind of cool here is you see these people kind of moving around and there's monarchs doing stuff. Who is the most pivotal person in creating nations as we know them today? And really, to my opinion, there was two. There's two folks that really led this. One was Henry VIII. In his vision of Great Britain, it was not about a church, right? He wanted to throw up the Catholic Church because they were trying to tell him how to run his business. And who he could marry, and who he could divorce, and whose head he could chop off and not chop off. There were some problems with that. So he separated from the church in a very visual way, right? That had the impact on the average British citizen of making them feel very nationalistic about Great Britain. And by the end of his reign, when Elizabeth took over, it was very nationalistic. Britain was very, very British, which they really weren't before that. He was the monarch. And you can see that there's also a backlash to that. That means the monarch really isn't the leader anymore. They're more like a figurehead as this feeling is emerging in the world. Another one is Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon created so much infrastructure in France, so many new laws, so much structure. And a lot of what we look at today as national infrastructure and the concept of what nations are responsible for was actually invented by Napoleon Bonaparte. Not a lot of people know that. He had a huge impact on Europe, and it was a vision for European nations on how they should structure themselves moving forward. Pretty cool. So what are some good things about nations? Well, national borders give us a sense of identity, right? We know where we are. We know who we are. We have a cultural identity because of that. And we have something to feel good about. We're a little nationalistic about our nation, right? We're very proud of our flag. They also allow us to create a very large military that can defend our national borders, right? And that used to be something that was really important. Not so important anymore, right? If you're in the 1500s and the 1400s, super important. Totally get that. All the way through World War II. Today, how much time does the United States military spend defending U.S. national borders? Almost none, right? It defends U.S. interests, and it defends U.S. allies, and it defends allies' borders. But we really don't spend much time defending our borders proper. And most nations' armies don't. If you look at all of the largest armies in the world, the largest nations, their armies aren't really designed for border defense, are they? They're not really doing that anymore. So lots of good things about nations. They give us a national currency. They give us typically a national language, right? That the nation chooses as their language. And on and on. So there's some good things. Anything else you guys can think of that's cool about nations, that you like about nations? Use the microphone if you want to add. And you know what question's coming next, right? What are some bad things? So stay on the good here is all I'm saying.
Good things, yeah. Typically they have a unified legal code, which makes things easier within their borders.
Absolutely. A unity of law across a defined area, and a unity of commerce, trade, currency, taxation, all kinds of stuff within a defined border. Great one. Yeah, it's a really good one. Anybody else? Anything else they want to add on what's cool about nations?
Language.
We'll talk about what's bad about nations in just a minute, because that's a fun topic too.
Actually, I was going to make the point that it's not necessarily absolutely necessary to have a physical border that is contiguous and reflects the nation state. The New Hebrides, or Vanuatu as they're called now, actually had a British and French Commonwealth control for about a century and a half, plus their own local control.
Yep.
And if you went to trial with somebody, you could end up with 3 different courts simultaneously handling that trial.
Yeah, not always having that unification of law that we were just talking about. So a lot of nations didn't have that. There was also in Vietnam during the French incursion in there. That was strange because you had French leadership and then you had Vietnamese leadership, and depending on where you landed, the law, the way you were tried for a crime could be totally different. Or even the crimes that you could commit could be totally different within the same nation. So it doesn't always work smoothly, right? Nations are all on a different path and wind up in different areas. So some things that I think are bad about nations. Oh, before we go there, what power does a nation have today? Let's come back to that. Let's go to what's bad about nations. I've messed up my slides. Okay, that's not good. So just pretend that there's a slide there that says what's bad about nations. So some bad things that I observe about nations. One is they cause nationalism, which is ironic because I said that was one of the good things about nations, right? But it's also one of the bad things. We can get really spooled up about our nation, about how we're better than another nation. It can be used nationalism can be used as a tool to make you feel like you're better than someone else or you're above them, right? And I think that's an interesting challenge specifically for the United States. We have that issue where sometimes we may feel that the United States is superior culturally or militarily or whatever to other nations. And that's a dangerous game because every nation is unique and has its own value proposition, right? So that's one thing I observed that's really bad. What are some of the things you guys see about nations that are not so good, that you don't like?
I'd say the nationalism idea, really the structure of government also allows for controlling the boundaries. Who can go where, when, and how difficult it can be to move between locations.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about it, in the United States, we don't have that problem because we have interstate commerce all the time. But in lots of nations, you can't move around and you're trapped in the nation completely. You can't leave. We've seen some very interesting defections from North Korea over the last 2 months. And today there was a bunch of news stories about these boats that are washing up on shore with all these poor dead Koreans in them, North Koreans, and they're trapped by their nation. Also, sometimes nationalized health care can prevent people from getting the kind of care they need because only certain classes people have different rights. The class system that some nations have can be very bad for citizens. So, anything else? Anybody else? Comments? Okay. So they're kind of a mixed bag, nations. And remember where they came from. They came from kind of wanting to get rid of monarchies and identifying something different than monarchies, really in the time preceding World War I. And then by the end of World War I, that was the way we were doing it. So, what power does a nation have today over you? What power does the United States have over you? Well, it tells you a preferred language to speak, but it doesn't force you in this country to speak that language. But in other countries it does. Yet. In other countries you can't say there's certain words. You can't speak certain languages. You have to conform to the national identity, right? You really can't live in France and not speak French. It's just not really practical to do that. So what are some of the powers that nations have? Keep that mic moving around.
Currencies.
They carry...
Buy what you
Well, and they also manipulate the value of the currency, right? We've seen some really interesting currency manipulation from China in the last year, of them trying to keep up the value of the Chinese yuan, even though their industrial capacity is not being utilized at its fullest anymore. So lots of different things that governments have power. The main power a government has is what? What's the main power of the United States government? Anybody? Bueller? To raise and manage the military. Right? So if you think about the main power, the most overt thing that the U.S. government does, it runs the U.S. military. It's the same thing all the way back to Rome, right? The reason Rome had power was because of the Roman legions. And then there was a couple times where it was confusing. Who had the power? Caesar, the Senate, or the legions. Sometimes it was the legions that had the power, right? And we've seen that recently, where in Africa, we just saw this where the military took over the country, one of the countries, and said the leader is no longer valid, and we're just going to wait until he acknowledges that he's no longer the leader, and then he stepped down and a new person took over. So for that moment, the military was in power, not the leadership of the nation. So raising an army to me is one of the biggest powers they have. Power to regulate commerce, power to, go ahead.
Taxation.
The power of taxation over you, right, that's a big one. The power to tax everything you do everywhere you go to whatever level they want. So lots of powers that nations have, but who gives them that power? You do voluntarily, but you don't have to. You don't have to give them that power. Think about it. It's better for you in most cases to do that. But the power that nations have is really given to them by their citizens. Think about how many nations were overthrown, how many governments were done away with in the last 5 years on this planet. Now that didn't necessarily affect the nation, but it did completely change the leadership of the nation. And in some cases, change the entire future course of the nation. So it's interesting when you think about the power that nations have. Personally, I see national power getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller every year. The President of the United States right now has lots of things that he wants the United States to do. He's having a lot of trouble getting anything done at all. If you look at the actual power that the US federal government is exerting over its citizens today, it's not being very successful at doing what it wants to do, even though it has an overt majority in both houses. And that's a really interesting moment in time where the national entity power doesn't seem to have the power over its citizens that you would think it would. So I think it's interesting. There's a lot of things eroding now, so we'll talk about that. Do we still need nations? Can you guys imagine a world with no nations?
Yes.
You should start thinking that way, because it's been predicted many times by futurists that in the future there will be no nations, because they will serve no purpose. And I think that was very premature. I think a lot of that commentary about the end of the nation state wasn't really recognizing the value propositions that nation states provide and the good stuff that they do. It was more focused on the negative things that they do. But I do think that as we move forward, think of all the technologies that are eroding this, right? Commerce, globalization, Alibaba, Amazon, Google. Those things are eroding the power of nation states enormously. And as we move into the near future, things like cryptocurrencies are even more eroding the power of nation states. They can, in some cases, make it so that nations don't know how to tax you because they can't track the transactions going on. And on and on and on. So technology is definitely something that makes the nation state less powerful. And it's an interesting kind of juxtaposition when you look at the nation states trying to exert their power in this time while they're simultaneously losing their power over their citizens. It's just an interesting yin and yang that's kind of occurring at the same time. So let's talk about the next 50 years, because we kind of got where nations came from, why we do this, what good they've brought for us, what bad they've done to us. And I think we're feeling pretty good about our nation in particular. I think some other nations are not feeling so good about their nation right now, their national entity. But some of the things that are going on right now are really interesting. Like, here's a new question. If you wanted to leave your nation and not be part, an area wanted to leave, like if Huntington Beach wanted to not be part of the United States anymore, historically, we could do that. We just have to raise an army and fight a war and defeat the US federal military, right?
Piece of cake.
Piece of cake. I don't think we can do that here in Huntington Beach, although there are some tough people here. So, but today we're seeing sections of nations voting to leave that nation. And that being considered okay by the national governments. Think about what a monumental historic change that is. That means that the national borders are not as permanent as we want them to be. They can be changed by the citizens of a region merely voting to not be part of it. The whole issue with Catalonia in Spain that's going on right now, that's not over. They just weren't doing it within the structure of the Spanish Constitution, so their separatist movement was crushed. But if they come back at it and do it within the governing body of the Spanish Constitution, they could probably succeed. And I think we're going to see that more and more and more as sections of nations decide maybe not to be part of that nation. Well, like California. Do we really want to be part of the United States? So far, it's working out okay for us, but there's been many times in California history where it's been promoted that California vote to leave the United States. That's a really strange idea. Obviously, Scotland is looking to vote to leave Great Britain. So I don't know where that's going to go in the future. That's a really strange, different way of thinking about it. So a nation that cannot defend its borders is not a nation at all. That's a quote by Donald Trump.
Really? You use Donald Trump?
I use Donald Trump.
Like,
It's a good quote, and it's really an important quote, because this really is what a nation is about, defending its borders. So we've seen a lot of global migration in the last year, in 2017, just dealing with this year. This comes from the Syrian refugee crisis. There's a lot of bad things happening in the Middle East. It's untenable for some people to live there. So that's actually the border crossing at Syria and the tent camp that's there. Roughly 1.2 million refugees left the Middle East and entered into Italy, Germany, and France, and Belgium, and a bunch of other places. And we saw a lot of bad things happen, right? There was a lot of people that came in that were not refugees. There were people posing as refugees that were really militants or terrorist combatants. Or they were doing it for economic gain, right? So it was very, very difficult. It's been a big problem in Europe, and is partially responsible for Britain leaving the European Union, is this mass influx of refugees. And it was handled very badly by everyone, right? Think about how badly this was handled. As good as they tried to do it, right? France really let in a lot of people, and then immediately started having a huge uptick in terrorist activity because of the way they were treating the refugees and because of just the way they managed themselves. We've seen this in everywhere, right? This has been a huge problem, suddenly letting in mass influx of refugees. And that's about national borders, right? Why were they leaving their nation? Why were they immigrating? Because in this particular case, it's because where they were was no longer safe, right? They had to get out or die. But you guys are forgetting about something really important that you all know, that we've talked about many times. This is what's going on the planet right now, right? We've talked about all the environmental destruction that's going on. We've talked about global warming. We've talked about rising sea levels. And we also talked about the reality that in the next 50 years, a huge portion of the Earth is no longer going to be habitable. It's estimated that 200 million people will have to move because they can't stay where they are. If we can't handle 1.2 million people, how in the world are we going to move 200 million or more between nation states? Nation states are not good at this, right? You can't defend your border against humanity who's fleeing environmental destruction. I know this because we saw it in the United States. We're seeing it in Puerto Rico right now. We're seeing it all over the planet, where places where people are, they can't be there. They have to move. Did you guys ever see the movie Day After Tomorrow? One of my favorite films. And the whole lower half of the United States or the whole upper half of the United States is rendered uninhabitable. And we all have to move south to Mexico. That's a very realistic probability, not that particular one, but that kind of movement, these mass migrations we know are going to increase. That's a real big problem for national borders, right? Or nation states in general. Because nation states are built on treaties and things that were done at the end, typically of wars and major conflicts, that then outlined a people and said, now you're a people. Think about the border of Iraq. What is Iraq? Are they a common unified people, unified by language, culture, or race? Nope. And that has been nothing but trouble for them since their border was artificially created, I believe, by the British in World War II. So, nations are a very strange animal. As we move forward into the future, I just have a hard time seeing them surviving in their current infrastructure. Those people, by the way, are called climate change refugees, and their number is increasing dramatically every year. So what do you think is going to happen in nations? This is a really interesting question. They are evolving, right? They're getting less power. They're still wielding these large armies, but they don't really use them or engage them much. What's the future for these structures? I think that's my last slide, so I'm just going to leave it on that. And that's really the topic tonight is, where do you see this going? So I'll give you a couple of my answers, and then we'll switch and get your guys' answers. So one of the things that I think is interesting is, I always like to look back, right? What did we have before we had national boundaries? How did it work? Well, we had empires. They were kind of a difficult animal. But we also had city-states going way back. A city-state would be like, imagine like our counties are very similar to city-states. And more, you're seeing a lot of power of government switching from the federal level to the city or county level. So even though we may not know this, we are actually moving back towards city-states. We just don't call them that anymore. They're counties in the United States, or provinces in France, or something like that. And we're seeing that movement of political power all over the world. And that's a good thing. We'd rather be locally managed and controlled by a local government that understands our local problems. Like here in Southern California, water is a huge problem. One of the problems in California is because of our length north to south and the difference of the environment in Northern California versus Southern California and the culture and everything else. They're so different that they really should be two separate states under our structure today. And that's been tried many times. And I think eventually that might actually happen. But in a city-state, you could move around like you do in the United States. We actually are a union of city-states. You just may not have thought about that. And our federal government has very little power. Its real power is to tax and to create a military for national defense. And that's really it. All the other stuff the federal government does is kind of a growth of that mandate, right? Either taxation or management or defense. In some cases, they're not defending us. The national parks are a way to defend against habitat erosion and to create parks for the people, right? To preserve those areas in their natural state. That counts kind of as national defense. And if you think about it that way, our structure is actually pretty unique. So if you look at it going forward, I would see more and more power in the city-state, in the county-type area, and less at the national entity level. Like one of the things that's really breaking down right now is the whole international trade management, right? How many things have the United States been cut out of, or trade deals we've done, or NAFTA, or these things? And suddenly, are those good or bad anymore? What was good 2 years ago is no longer good? I'm confused. Why are we having all that type of structure? And it's because the nations are trying to exert political power and economic power between each other. That's not what the citizens want, right? We want our nation to make its goods and be able to sell them on the global market. And it's not in the United States' case, but in a lot of other nations' case, you can't do that. It has to go through the national entity. One of the worst atrocities ever in human history, economically, was the East India Trade Company when Great Britain took over India. India's major thing that they made was cotton. It was their largest export. And everybody in India pretty much worked in the cotton industry and made lots of money out of it. Suddenly, you couldn't sell cotton if you were Indian. You had to go through the East India Trade Company, and Britain sold that cotton. That's a terrible idea. And it was a terrible idea. And eventually, the Indians threw the British out over that very issue. See how that works? Oppress the people some of the time. You can't oppress all the people all the time. So what are some of the things you guys see going forward? Any other ideas on the future of national boundaries?
Don't you think the path is the city-state idea is through?
It's through challenging?
Yeah. Because those in power don't have to do that.
It's different everywhere, right? So in the United States, actually, we're doing it pretty gently. You know, there's more and more power in the states. That's obviously a trend that we're on. There's more and more taxation in the states, as opposed to the federal government. I would like to see the federal government lower our taxes, the federal taxes. Because, you know, and quite frankly, I agree with a lot of things that the Republican Party says, this is my opinion, that we are paying for a lot of things that probably should be transferred to our local government. It shouldn't be going from California to the federal government and then doled out. That doesn't make a lot of sense. California is like, I don't know, the 6th largest economy in the world. How much of the United States is being paid for by California? A lot through our federal taxes. So, you know, that's, when you look at those areas, we are moving that way in the United States. Now, other places aren't, right? Obviously, North Korea is not going to become a city-state structure anytime soon. It's very top-down. And that's because that's their structure. But I think that over time, the nations that understand this change is occurring and that the role and value of their national borders is different than it was in 1500s is going to do better, right? Like putting up a wall around the United States and blocking foreign people from coming in. There's two parts to that. One is putting up a wall around the United States to control people coming in. The other one is preventing people from coming in. Should you prevent people from coming to the United States? No, our population will go down, and we need new people coming in for new ideas and new labor and all the good things that come from immigration. And in fact, lots of people are going to come in, right? You got the climate refugees, you've got political asylum refugees, you've got all kinds of people in the world that have to leave where they are. And you've got economic people that want to come here and have a better life economically than where they are. Those we call Americans, right? That's what Americans are. They're people that want to go somewhere and make a better life. So for us, it's not that we want to keep people out, it's that we want to control how they come in. And I think that's something that when we look at immigration, that's something we're really going to have to focus on, is making sure that people coming in are getting indoctrinated the right way. And a good example here is France. The way France brought people in the last 50 years, they didn't do a lot to make them French or indoctrinate them or help them. They kind of put them up in an area, and that creates barriers, right? We've seen that, where suddenly there's like this little town, that little town, and they're all a single race or culture within that defined area. And people do that naturally, right? We see that here in the United States all the time. But that's okay. You want to keep working on the common things that we work together on, right? The commonality of language, the commonality of commerce, the commonality of food, right? Imagine if we hadn't brought all the Chinese railroad workers here. Would we have Chinese food today? The United States would be a much smaller place without Chinese food. I love Chinese food, right? And it's on and on and on. We are so enriched by immigration. It's silly to slow it down. But other nations don't think that way. They're not enriched by immigration. They reject anybody that isn't the exact same stripe as them. And I think those nations are going to be ever increasingly economically challenged to compete with nations that allow for more free movement between their borders. Make sense? You can disagree with them, it's fully fine.
Don't you think that idea also opens up to the challenge of imperialism? So that the countries that are part of the haves rather than the have-nots has more nations that we see the rise more of, we'll help you out, and we're going to hold that part of this larger economic regime.
I think definitely there's a challenge, like I'll use Mexico and the United States as a problem. When you have two nations that are near each other that have great economic disparity, you got to be careful of letting everyone from the poor nation move to the rich nation, because it hurts the poor nation, right? So the U.S. does limit in how many people can get visas and how long they can stay here and stuff. And I think it's a good policy to encourage people to stay where they are and make it where they are. The reason they're fleeing Mexico in most cases isn't because of any type of refugee type status. They're fleeing Mexico they can earn more money in the United States. But interestingly, over the last 20 years, that has really changed. A lot of Mexican people can make more money in Mexico now than they can in the United States, and they have immigrated back to Mexico because we aren't the land of milk and honey like we used to be. So that's an interesting move. And I think that movement is natural, right? I think that's Mexico's problem to look at. How do we retain our citizens? And just like city-states today are all competing for the Amazon global headquarters, right? Everyone wants that new Amazon headquarters in their city because it would make them tax revenue and make their city a better place, in theory. It's like having the Olympics in your city. Is it good? I don't know. Could be bad. So that's an interesting thing. But as those things move, I think that's the role of city-states, is to make themselves attractive for people to immigrate there. And certainly within the United States, our cities spend a lot of time advertising themselves to the American citizens that this is a good place to live and raise children and work. We see those ads all the time on TV of cities encouraging people to move to their area and incentivizing companies to move to their areas through tax credits and things like that. So I think of that on a larger picture, that if everything was like that, and there really was no national border, and the cities were the counties, thinking more like counties, were competing for citizens to come there, and you could all move around. That's kind of a wild idea. Did you have a comment? Can you pass the mic up there? Thank you.
Thanks. I missed much of what is being said because of my hearing problem. And I came late, so I missed your introduction. But I know on the sex thing last time, you gave a historical introduction.
Mm-hmm.
Same here?
Yep, yeah, we went through the history of nations. I'm going to turn your mic up just a little bit. Sorry about that. I think it's this one. There we go. Let's make it a bit louder. Yeah, we went through the history of nations and where they came from, where the idea of nations. And nations are a pretty new thing, really only starting around the 1500s to even have nations. Before then, it was empires that kind of moved freely around the planet.
Yeah, in Central Europe, Germany, for example, it was an opportunity to escape the power of the church,
Mm-hmm.
and the national leaders had an opportunity also to enrich themselves, following the example of the church.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm thinking about now is that another issue is political ideology. And I was thinking of what's happening since Trump has been elected. Must really inspire, because Putin represents a totalitarian solution. And of course, he thinks that's the best way.
Naturally.
We have a different view. But when we had democracy, look who we elected.
Yeah.
So he's probably speaking because we've done it to ourselves, and it just reinforces Putin's idea of the superiority of totalitarianism.
Which I think was Andrew's point, is that there is definitely an issue that free nations always have a challenge against totalitarian type nations, right? So the more top-down a nation is, the quicker it can do things, right? So I'll give you a good example. In the original 13 colonies, one of the most, you should pass that over there because he needs it. In the original 13 colonies, the most successful one economically was Pennsylvania. Not a lot of people know that. And it's because William Penn ran it like a dictatorship. And it was a benevolent dictatorship. If you get the right leader in a completely totalitarian structure, then it's wonderful to live in that place until that leader changes, right? And then it can be terrible to live in that place. But it just depends on the leader. And the reason that we went away from those monarchy, totalitarian type governments is because we saw the vacillation between a great leader and a terrible leader, and a great leader, right? And then terrible, and then one good one, and then, oh my God, this one's really bad. And there was no way to build a stable culture in those environments. So it's an interesting migration that we've gone to. And that's really one of the things that the people began to pull that power into a national structure. And that was one of the things we talked about, is when nations began forming, it was really because of this new feeling of nationalism and the building of a national identity that was more the people felt that instead of the monarchs driving it. And that, and then we talked about how that led to the French Revolution and things like that, but the people really created their nation and their nation's culture. So, yeah.
There's a problem that cities run into, particularly in counties, but more so than states and the national government. That has to do with issues like the homeless,
Yeah.
the immunity factor, not in our backyard. If any city in Orange County decides to make life better or less miserable for the local 40,000, excuse me, for the homeless in Orange County, then the homeless will go to that city, obviously.
Yeah.
So there's a direct competition or a conflict between what is right and what people know should be done, and what actually ends up getting done because of constraints that nobody wants to done in your backyard.
But interestingly, on that subject, on the subject of homeless people, which is a great example, all of that is managed by cities, city by city. There is no federal policy on
That's the problem.
homeless management. Yeah.
But
And I get where you're coming from, but it's also, is it a federal problem? Is this something that the federal government should have to do with, or should the citizens within that region decide their level of magnanimity? I can't say
Well,
it.
just leaving people-
How magnanimous they are.
There was a movement which was fairly widespread and well known 20, 30 years ago called, I don't know how far back it goes, it was called Lanu.
Uh-huh.
Lanuism. And it involved VW camper, but there were tens of thousands of people at one point who were doing this, retired people,
Yeah.
who buy a big motorhome,
Yep.
drive around the country, visit all their sons, daughters, grandchildren, etc., and have a great time with it. All that was shut down in response to the homeless problem.
Yeah. And there's a bunch of different movements like that, a bunch of different things that have happened that are on that same vein. So if you think, and here's why I think that it's more probable that in the future it'll be a city-state problem as opposed to a national problem. If you look at San Francisco has an enormous homeless population by percentage of people. And one of the things about San Francisco is it is environmentally easy to be homeless there. It's not it doesn't snow very often, right? And it's not blazing hot in the summer. There's lots of shelter there. And that city has a lot of money that it uses to help homeless people be homeless in a good way. There's centers you can go to, there's disease management places, there's hospitals, you can get health care, you can do all kinds of stuff in San Francisco because San Francisco has the amount of money to help pay for that. If you were talking a small town in Idaho and they suddenly had a huge homeless population, they would have no economic way of dealing with that. So it's difficult to have a similar policy across the whole nation when it comes to homelessness, or lots of other things. Homelessness is just a good example, because each city area has to be able to define its level of give to that problem. And I think it is not a coincidence that because San Francisco has such a benevolent and helpful policies around helping the homeless, that they have such a large population of homeless people that live there. And it is a challenge. Homelessness is a big challenge. You can't get rid of it. We've tried. And it's just going to be there. But I think each city has to decide, each city area, what it wants. And the citizens in that area have to decide that. And if you don't like it, you can move to another city. The important thing about city-states, and it's just one idea that I floated, is that there has to be free movement between them. Because then if you don't like it, you can move to one that has a better affinity towards you. So there's a lot of new things that are happening right now. I don't know if you guys heard, there's a new nation being built in space. And it's being built by a Russian guy. And they're conforming to the UN rules. And they put a thing up that had the membership of the people of the nation into space. And it's a space-based nation. And this is going before the United Nations to be voted on. Is this a legitimate nation? The people that are national members of this nation can have dual citizenship with their own home earthbound nation. But they can actually have a national identity with this nation in space. But I wouldn't call that a nation because it doesn't conform to any of the definitions of a nation. It's a city-state, right? It's just a city-state in space. Because it has no border, it has no cultural identity, it has no race, right? It's above all those things. Now, go way out in the future and start to think about the things that we've talked about where people may not be physical, right? They may not have a physical body. What role does a nation play in that future? None. None. There's no use for them at all.
So who is going
Can
to,
use the mic so that people online can hear. Thank you.
who is going to be the world's policeman in the future, because we can't afford to do it anymore?
Yes, absolutely. And that's another thing that's unfortunate about the way the national structures are today, is that the richest nations wind up acting as a police force for the poorer nations. Not just as a police force, right? We wind up doing all kinds of things for other nations. We help them out when they have crisis or catastrophe. We defend them when they have wars. That's how we're maintaining peace in the world today, is by the top 4 or 5 leading governments kind of allying up with people that need their help and creating these communities of like purpose. That also is very dangerous because those nations can find themselves in conflict with the other major nations, right? We've seen that bumping up Cold War thing go on for a long time. In the future, where we've kind of moved past this paradigm of nations, the city-states would ally together in the same way that nations ally together today, right? So, and we had this throughout all of Greece. Greece was very much like this. There were city-states that worked together, and when faced with an outside threat, they'd all come together, right? And they'd form an army of Greeks, and then they would fight off the Persians, typically. And then they'd all go back to their city-states, right? So just because you're a city-state doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility for defense. You do. and law. But think about this national police force idea, the global police force that the United States finds itself in more and more and more. That really would be better served by city-states coming together, agreeing on a charter through something like the UN, and then bringing together coalitions of the willing, as we used to call it, to then come to the defense or aid of another country or another city-state. And we've seen that, we've done that. That's a modern thing that's gone on. It was just because of the U.S.'s overwhelming economic and military power that we wound up being the leader. But during the first Gulf War, that was actually a really beautiful union of nations of like purpose coming together. And that could be city-states just as well. The second Gulf War was a little different story. Sir?
It could also go the way of Vanuatu, where actually they started that way. You could have a nation state in which every person basically was their own nation.
Yeah.
And they would have a treaty consisting of a contract with, let's say, one of the major providers today. With the people, the Omidyars that did eBay.
Mm-hmm.
You could have eBay and what's the financial one?
E-Trade,
E-Trade?
Yeah.
Or,
Amazon, or
okay.
Alibaba.
There, you could have a contract with them that made you a co-signatory with everybody else that signed a similar contract, and limited the effect of that contract, and otherwise would be tailored to the individual, so long as they could put up the cash or assets to back it. You could have a million city-states.
Sure. And think about the movement across this, right? If there was a global agreement on taxation and intercommerce, right? Inter-city-state commerce, which we're kind of getting towards already, right? Because we need that. Is it fair for California to be judged by the same economic rules for trade as Idaho? Globally? Obviously not, right? We're totally different. Totally different. How about Montana? Nope. Boston? How about Boston versus Framingham, Massachusetts? Right? We already know this is a problem, and it's a huge problem. How do you come up with trade laws and laws in general that can govern people when they live in such wildly different places? Wildly different. And it's a challenge. Nations have been a great thing. I think they've taken us from the age of empires forward into now bumping up on the third eon of mankind. But I believe when we move into this third eon structure, right, and we begin to have things like people living enormously long lives, we begin to have things where everyone is the same age. I had an interesting lunch with a young man the other day, and he is changing his face to be, he's Asian, to be more American. And I didn't realize it's a common thing for K-pop stars, Korean pop stars. They do this all the time. They make themselves physical through surgery look a little more American because it makes them more interesting to Koreans. Because a lot of the visions of beauty and looks today globally are defined by American movies, right? And American culture. So that's an interesting thing. It got me thinking, what about in the future when you can change your race? Through gene therapy, right? You don't even need to have surgery. If you can change your age, you certainly will be able to change your race. And lots of other things, right? A lot of the national identities today is around race. Japan is Japan because Japanese people live there. If I move to Japan, can I be embraced into that culture? Never, because I'm not Japanese. But what if I looked Japanese? You got to start thinking about things a little differently. Technology is going to change the very basic structures of how we live together and work together. Think about the way we structure. And national boundaries are going to be stuck in the same shifting sands of technology, right? They already are. The way Alibaba does things is very different than the way Amazon does things, right? They are all direct ship. When you buy something on Alibaba, you're buying it through Alibaba, but it's coming from the actual company that manufactures it. When you buy from Amazon, most of it's coming from an Amazon warehouse somewhere, right? You don't like it when it says this is being fulfilled by some other company. You want it fulfilled by Amazon. Think about how weird that is from a structure. Why is Alibaba different than Amazon. The United States has an enormous amount of road infrastructure. We can build warehouses and direct ship from warehouses all over the United States through our shipping infrastructure that we've built out over the last 100 years, and you can get it within 24 hours in most cases. That's not possible in Asia. There isn't that level of infrastructure. So Alibaba can't work that way. And that's what I'm talking about. I know it's a weird example, but that's what I'm talking about. Things are different by area. And the government of the people, for the people, should be by that area, not by some arbitrary border. Think about where the United States borders came from. What a hodgepodge of foolishness that was. We started on the East Coast. Why? Because they landed at Plymouth Rock. And that's the beginning of the nation. And then the British came and they formed 13 colonies. Because nobody owned that land. And then we started doing deals and taking more land. And eventually, it became this wholesale mad dash towards the west, right? In covered wagons. Where the government said, if you go out there and homestead that land, put your stake in the ground, stake your claim, that's your land. Oh, by the way, there's Indians and snakes and lizards and all kinds of other things that want to kill you. And people were like, okay with that, and we all ran towards the west, right? Because we wanted to get that land. But then that became somehow a nation of people from all over the world. And then we fought some border wars with Mexico, trying to decide where that southern border is, right? Which it seems like we're still sometimes trying to figure out where the southern border of the United States is. And then we worked out the northern border. And then we somehow wound up taking over Hawaii. I'm sure that wasn't an imperialistic move at all. And then we somehow wound up with Alaska. And now we've got lots of other weird things like Puerto Rico and Guam and American Samoa. So what is the meaning behind the definition of our border? I can't tell you. It doesn't define an area. It doesn't define a culture. It doesn't define a race. We just choose to belong to it because it does define a military, which is awesome. Who's first? Go ahead, sir. Hang on one second, Jesse. You want to say something?
The objection that I came up with immediately when you started this vein of your talk was that when I grew up in North Georgia, there were evidences of the prior civilization of the Cherokee.
Oh, yeah.
They'd been there for some time until they were driven out, and most of them died on the way to the Trail of Tears.
Yep.
And this is true all over the country, but even more so in Mexico, and I believe in Peru. I'm not sure about that. But the incursion of foreign diseases brought from Europe, for the Europeans, because of the geography, had
Sure.
inherited a high level of immunity in general compared to the Native Americans. And so you have a whole civilization that stretched the length of the Mississippi River, the mountain people, involving millions of people, and those people all died because of one expedition, an exploratory map-making expedition by the Spanish early on that carried 10 or so major diseases and simply wiped out an entire civilization. So it wasn't just a matter of happenstance or policy. It was simple epidemiology that they had not a clue about.
Sure, and violence. You know, most nations were created through violence, right? They were created through wars. And if you can kill it with diseases, it's so much better than fighting, right? But it's definitely, if you look where nations came from, it's not a pretty picture, right? And now they're there, and then we solidified their borders and solidified their boundaries, and nobody wants it to change. Because one of the things that we're really good at is not wanting anything to change, right? We don't want this to change. And the concept of changing national borders is a little terrifying to you, isn't it? Or doing away with it is scary, because it's what we grew up with, it's what we know, therefore we want it to stay the same. But I'm telling you, it can't. The way things are changing, can you pass that on over to Joyce? The way that things are moving, it's going to get increasingly dysfunctional to enforce national borders the way we've been doing it over the last 100 years. We have to come up with some new ideas and some new plans. Go ahead, Sarah.
Touching on what you were saying, how we acquired Hawaii and Alaska and everything else. So I think it started there. You kind of start seeing ownership take part in how you're developing a nation.
Mm-hmm.
So back to the question also, where you said where the nation's going to go in the future. I think it's going to become more like companies. So
That's a really good example,
So
yeah.
you're going to be, say, affiliated to Amazon or to this or to that, because even if a nation remains, they're just going to be based off of that economy.
Mhm.
So it's just kind of going to be, you can be in this country or that country, but you're affiliated to who you are responsible economically to, or
Yep.
who funds you.
Or where you get paid,
Exactly.
Right.
So it's just kind of.
which isn't going to be by some structured or national entity. And that's one of the reasons why we need a better managing body for global commerce above the nations. Because today the nations dictate to their own citizens what those rules are, and to other nations. And we've seen in the last 6 months that break down quite dramatically in the United States, where we're suddenly not wanted at the table for some of these economic meetings where they're deciding future economic trade policies. And that's a huge problem for the next 20 years of America, and something we really should do it. But think about Scotland. So imagine if Scottish people vote that they don't want to be part of England, and they want to form the nation of Scotland, which they may very well do. And then imagine if 6 weeks later, they vote to become part of the United States. Where's the national border? That's Scotland acting absolutely like a city-state, deciding who they want to ally with for economic gain. That's a city-state move of the first order. And that's what Catalonia is trying to do. That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's not going to happen like we just wave a magic wand and national borders go away. They're going to erode from the nations that aren't doing what the citizens want. They're not taking the citizens where they want to go. And global commerce and global currencies and cryptocurrencies and this new wave of technology is enabling smaller areas to have the economic power that traditionally was wielded by nations or monarchies or empires. Get it? And those are great examples of city-states becoming into their own right and breaking away from the old national structure. And I think it's interesting. I think Britain breaking away from the European Union is them acting like a city-state, but just the southern part of England, right? It's really England that did that. England proper, really the London area. It wasn't, I don't think it was Wales. And it certainly wasn't Scotland. They were not happy about that, right? It was just the English part of England breaking away from the European Union. That's odd. But it's a very small area with a very defined economic reality that's a little bit different than Scotland's. It's a little bit different than Ireland's. That's exactly what I'm talking about. That shifting sand of national boundaries. And I think it's going to be fun watching it. I like this a lot better than the old way, right? The old way, if Scottish people wanted to leave, they'd all strap on their swords and put on their war kilts and march over there and start throwing rocks at the English. That didn't work out very well. I've seen those movies. That was horrible. Let's never do that again. Let's never fight wars about national boundaries. Let's vote on what we want to be a part of, developing a local cultural identity and a local economic identity, and then pick where we want to go. The last part is going to be the hardest part. The first part will come first, right? Places will break away from whatever they want and form their own unions, whatever they want. The last part is really difficult. If I wanted to move to Scotland today for economic or cultural gain, can I just do that? No. We can't just move around. Maybe there's a lottery because you can only let in so many people, right? Start thinking this through. And once we start moving away from being biology-based people, this gets really complicated. Because then what are you a part of? Right? You're not feeding off the land. You're not doing it now. You're eating tomatoes grown in Mexico. Right? You're not living here. That's an illusion. Everything that's here comes from somewhere else. Some of it comes from here, which is good. But most of it comes from somewhere else. Every piece of electronic gear in here isn't from here, it's from somewhere else. So we're already economically past this. We're just not culturally past it or politically. Do you have another comment?
So the way that countries or nation states are trying to associate themselves with other nations, at what point do you think it's going to become that the larger nation states are going to start asking the small ones to join them, kind of scouting and recruiting to grow their power?
Yeah, I think the larger ones are going to be the first to break apart. because of their largeness, right? Because of their unions. Now, the United States is different because it's a union. It's a nation, but it's really a union. It's different. And would we allow a state to vote to not be part of this union anymore? We allow them to vote to be part of the union, but we've never allowed one to vote to not be part of the union. Especially California. They're a great example. If California decided they don't want to be part of the United States anymore because of unfair taxation in their minds, would the United States of America let California secede from the union? Think of the economic impact of what I just said. California pays for a lot of the union. It would devastate the United States if California left. And it would immediately be followed by other city-states. So it's interesting. I think some places, the nations have no choice. In Great Britain's case, they have no choice. If Scotland wants to leave, Scotland's going to leave. In Spain's case, they had a choice, and they said no. And the Catalonians shook their fists and stamped and rallied in the streets, and the answer was no. So they're not leaving. But that's not the end of that. They're going to come back at that, right? So we're just at the beginning of this shift. The next 50 years will be really interesting to see how national borders become different than what they are and how we think about it and how they begin to erode. And then later we'll get to how do you move around, how can you choose what you want to be a part of. You're not going to get to choose, you're going to be wherever you are, and that's going to move, right? But I don't think the little guys are going to try to join up with the big guys. I think they'll maintain their sovereignty. I think that any little nation that has become part of a bigger nation, the loss of sovereignty, they're feeling now. Argentina is a great example, right? They're definitely feeling their loss of sovereignty, and they want it back. So I think it'll be more like I want to economically align myself with the United States, and I'd like to become like a territory or a protectorate or something like that. More like the Philippines, where we get all the advantages, but we don't have all the negative stuff. And the Philippines are having a big anti-American, feeling right now in a huge way. They love the protection, but they don't like all the economic crap that we're doing to them. So they may choose to unally themselves, but they're not an official state. Make sense? Any other questions? We're getting past the 8 o'clock hour. Sir?
I really think that the future of the nation state lies with the less development and what they, and we'll have to deal with that. And that will, I think, dictate quite a bit about what happens in the future with nation states.
Sure. Think about Africa. We've talked about Africa many times. Think about a Pan-African economic union, like the European Union, that they agree on commerce and trade and movement between those countries, that then can be enforced by the city-states coming together and forming a militia to enforce their Pan-African Union laws. That would, if they could pull that off, that would change Africa forever. But they could maintain their sovereignty within their local city-states, because they really are a city-state continent, right? There's so many different nations that they're not really nations, they're really city-states. We just call them nations because that's the thing we do today is national borders. But the national borders within Africa are a disaster, because what it really creates is fiefdoms where they fight against each other. And that really needs to go away. If Africa is ever going to move forward in the world economy, they need to stop that letting despots run the city-states and stop having dictators with the city-states and let those people run their own city-state and then ally together into communities of purpose to achieve greater economic gain. And they need some infrastructure, which you can't build when you have, these little tiny defined, what was the word we used, totalitarian regimes in there. There's no way to build infrastructure Pan-Africa, and they really need that to move forward. But I think this structure would work well for them, very well, yeah. And most of Europe, most of the Middle East, anywhere that's like that, And then you run into the problem, which is the despot guys, the Vladimir Putins, the Kim Jong-uns. They're not going to let go. They're going to force their people into compliance, and if they don't comply, they're just going to kill them. Right? This is a no-choice option for them. But I don't know how long that type of government will be allowed to stand in the future. We're already seeing huge problems within North Korea from its own people being pushed to the limits by their leadership. And, we saw that in Libya. The people were just like, we're done, overnight. They went from we're happy to we're done, right? And lots of other places in the Middle East have gone through this change where they've just gotten rid of their despotic leadership. The problem is then, how do you create a new leadership structure for the city-state? And that is a question that we'll have to do in another meeting. But it's definitely an issue. How do you then create a government when you have a huge lack of literacy within your nation? Leadership like we have only works when you have very literate citizens that can be informed and can make decisions and can check in to be a part of the governing body of the nation. But in a lot of these places, there's such a high level of literacy that there's no way to do that. That's why they have those types of governments, by the way, is that they can be oppressed and there's really no other choice. So that's a huge problem, I think, is, and probably another meeting would be, global illiteracy levels. How do we change that moving forward? Because the other alternative is if we don't fix that problem, all those people are going to get left behind, right? We will vanish into the third eon, and they will be left here in the second eon, because they never really got to the second eon. They're still at the first to second eon change. With me? They're going to be stuck in the literacy land, and that's a nightmare. We don't want to leave anybody behind. So, different problem. Any other comments or questions? You guys are really good tonight. Good.
Humans, I think we've learned in the recent decades that there's been vast human migrations from ancient times.
Oh, yeah.
And it's still leading to new discoveries as recently as, I think, yesterday. I read a comment about a recent scientific paper casting doubt on the idea that we all came from Africa.
Mm-hmm.
I was okay with that, But apparently they found some other things that indicate that some other unique things that have now worldwide actually came from Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at, and when we ran the map, I don't think you were here, we ran the map of national evolutions from, I think, like 3000 BC forward. It went through that. One of the things that's interesting, if you watch it closely, everything's happening over here in Mesopotamia, right? In that area, in Iraq and around and all in that area. And then all of a sudden there's like this big thing that happens in China. All the way over in the east, totally independently. And then it starts pushing out. And then it's very strange how that area evolved into a national entity. And then you watch the Mongols just take over all of the steppe, right? All of the whole Eurasian continent, the whole top Eurasian continent is the Mongols. And then they push against China, and then you can just see them going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until finally the Chinese and the Russians eradicated them. So it's interesting, the amount of time that people move, and there's reasons why they move. But in our short time here, since the 1500s, we really haven't had any reason for mass migrations of people. So the national border systems have worked fairly well. But that, like we were talking about in the Middle East, that's already breaking down because of refugees leaving the Middle East. And when we start to move towards climate refugees or natural disaster refugees, that could be in the millions and millions of people suddenly immediately needing to move. This is going to really challenge the national border system, because what's your other choice? Let them die? That's not a good choice. And it reflects very badly on you as a nation if you just let them die. So things are going to change whether we want it to change or not. It's just going to happen. And the trick is doing it artfully and smoothly and thoughtfully. And I have to give England a lot of credit on this. It's not often that I give them a lot of credit. Their management and handling of the Scottish feeling has been brilliant. It's been brilliant. They were like, we're right in the middle of Brexit. We're not going to let you do it now. We will let you do it later, but not right now. Because Scotland leaving in the middle of Brexit would have been an epic disaster for Great Britain. And the Scottish people, I would say begrudgingly, said, okay, and we'll come back to that later. That's really adult behavior for a nation. Really adult behavior. I don't think our nation would have handled it that well. So we'll see where it winds up. It's an interesting moment in world history. So you guys have been great. I have to end the Facebook broadcast. Thanks everybody for watching on Facebook. We'll catch you next week on Tuesday. Thanks for watching AEON3.